So let's turn back to Korea, this vibrant culture on this little peninsula squeezed between Japan and China, a culture that adapts from and gives to these larger cultures as it maintains its integrity. So the story of Korea takes a twist in 1392 when the new dynasty is established, the Joseon dynasty, after the overthrow of the Goryeo dynasty. So the capital is moved. Seoul becomes the capital, a capital familiar to us today. In terms of culture, this is a time when the elite culture, the ruling class culture, will be very closely affiliated with Ming China, with the imperial culture of China. And part of that is the Neo-Confucianism that you learned about in your studies of the Song dynasty. And so Buddhism, which had been so important in the artistic cultural development prior to the overthrow of the Goryeo dynasty, is pushed aside for Neo-Confucianism. And we're going to look at painting because it becomes very important, but also because it really embodies the tension that is present in Korean culture at this time between a very close affiliation with Chinese tradition, but also a growing interest in Korea's own personality as a culture, if you will, its own geographic identity, the place that is Korea, and its own cultural heritage. We already saw the deep alignment with Chinese painting in the Goryeo dynasty, when we saw this seated, what we would call Avalokiteshvara, if we're speaking in Sanskrit, this Guanyin, if we're speaking in Chinese. And what you can see here is that the Chinese influence in Korea includes these Tang international style elements, such as the plump face. It includes this courtly elegance, which is certainly in the royal robes, which are important to a bodhisattva who wears princely garments and a crown as identifying features. But there's also a courtliness in the artistic style itself, the delicacy of the line work, the ability to make these subtle transparencies, to make the colors so bright and luxurious and ornamental, but also very subtle and as if done with the lightest and most delicate of touches. And we can really see the Chinese landscape tradition here if we look at An Gyeon, who is a major painter of the Joseon dynasty, painting a dream journey to the peach blossom land. A hand scroll with ink and colors on silk. So we can compare it to Wang Hui's Thousand Peaks and Myriad Ravines, a hanging scroll. And we can see how in both we have paintings that give us an ideal beauty in nature, using kind of conventional motifs, conventional ideas of the ravines, the conventional idea of a scholar's retreat on a river of 9 beds. These are traditional elements. And so the painting is based on this marvelous sort of miniature story, or fable might be the word, The Peach Blossom Spring, written by Tao Tian in the 4th century. So the marvelous story involves a fisherman who is traveling and comes upon a grove of blossoming peach trees. All out of the blue, here are these peach trees with fragrant flowers, delicate and lovely to the eye. And he explores, he finds in the side of the hill a small opening. And he enters, he passes through this passageway and discovers this kind of magic land where people were coming and going. Everyone was dressed in exactly the same manner. White-haired elders and tufted children alike were cheerful and contented. And this is a kind of land that time forgot, because it turns out these people had fled from the violence of the Qin dynasty, and they had gone into this isolated place and hidden away there. And so the fisherman dwells among them for a few days, eats with them, and they warn him, do not speak of us to the people outside. But of course, this being a fable and a myth, what does he do? He goes back to his boat, he retraces his route, and he tells everyone about this amazing place with this wonderful peach blossoms and these people. And so then he goes and he looks for it again, but he can never find it again. So the landscape that An Gyeon is painting is in no way a real place, right? This is an ancient, very old-fashioned, long ago traditional poem based on a fantasy place from a fable. And similarly, Wang Hui's is not a real place. It's a compilation of motifs that created a sense of ideal beauty with scholars' pavilions and the ravines, a kind of flowing place of boundless nature, peacefully experienced. So this Korean painting that is engaged with Chinese traditions as it's represented by the Peach Blossom Land is very much about enchantment, the enchantment of an ideal fantasy world, which is why I'm actually comparing it here, if you can see closely, to the Wizard of Oz and the Emerald City. Because I'm making a little joke, the Emerald City with its sort of stacked green towers reminds me of these vertical forms, these upright monolithic rock forms in the Peach Blossom Land that are almost like conveying the sense that it's a hidden away place, right? There's a kind of misty sense, and then there's the sense of these jagged rock forms that hide this wonderful place. So it is about a fantasy world that expresses, in the case of China, the longing for lost, because it was made at the time of the period of disunion, for lost parts of the territory, lost to outside dynasties. It expresses a sense of kind of the internal landscape of longing. And that's different from what comes next. In the later Joseon dynasty, so the time of the Qing dynasty, the time of the kind of academic courtly literati painting that we saw, in Korea, there is a movement, the Shilhak movement, which is focused on practical learning. So not learning the old Tang Dynasty fable about the Peach Blossom Land from, the grand imperial tradition of China, but instead learning about Korea's geography. That's practical and it's local, and it is specific to Korean identity, as is learning about the natural environment, the culture, and the history of the Korean peninsula. So instead of kind of a Confucianist tradition, now there's a tradition of the local, the regional, just exploring Korea's customs. It's a tradition of what's near at hand and close to heart. And so this is related to Qingyang, which is true view or real scenery. So no longer a fantasy world created out of kind of stock painting elements, but now a painting that is wanting to actually depict a recognizable place. And here, the Kumgang Mountains, a famous place, a place that is a cherished place. And so when I'm saying a cherished place central to Korean heritage and identity, you might compare it in your mind, say, to the Grand Canyon, right, for American identity. This kind of grand landmark and monument that is part of the mystique of America. And we can say that about the Kumgang Mountains and the mystique of Korea. So this famous and beloved mountain range has all sorts of poetic names. 12,000 peaks, All Bone Mountain, so when you have its wintry, snowy peaks, Autumn Foliage Mountain. So it's not as if there isn't poetry. There certainly is poetry with True View, but it's actually responding to this local experience of regional landmarks and what defines Korea as a place. So in this painting by Chong Song, we have an inscription, which is actually a poem. And I said, note the semicircular form of the calligraphy. Note how the artistic movement, the artistic choices of laying down the calligraphy in this way integrates it with the landscape so that the space here becomes an echo of mountainous forms. And it reads, 12,000 peaks of all bone mountain. Who would even try to portray their true images? That's always amusing when a painter poet does that because, well, obviously he just did try, but he's sort of acknowledging that this is an ambitious task and whether he can actually get to the truth. He's playing with the idea of true view. Can he actually get the truth of this mountain range? Because it's difficult. Why? Well, their layers of fragrance float beyond the Pusong tree, which is an imaginary tree in the Eastern Sea where the sun rises. So beyond the mythical tree that marks the sunrise, their accumulated qi swells expansively throughout the world. So they certainly have this like kind of magical quality to them, even though they are a real place. Rocky peaks like lotus flowers emit whiteness. Pine and juniper forests obscure the entrance to the profound. This careful sojourn on foot through Mount Kumgang, how can it be compared with the view from one's pillow? So that is actually referencing a famous 4th century Chinese painter scholar, Zongbing, who said that when he grew too old to climb mountains, he was going to cover the walls of his room with images of mountains and lying in his bed, roam around them with his eyes. So there's a little joke here about like, well, the actual experience of journeying on foot through this mountain range is nothing like just meandering with your eyeballs while you're laying on your pillow. The sense that the kind of the mystery, the depth, the complexity, the truth of it exceeds what art can do. So this rich and really remarkably deep painting has so many aspects to it because while it is very much about a true view, point of view, you could say, it's very much engaged, I said, with Southern style invention, right? Dong Chi Chang's Southern style, invent, don't just copy, make it new, make it fresh. So it's full of kind of the yin and the yang. In fact, some scholars have sort of read a kind of hint of the yin yang in the way the light and the dark interact. But it's certainly full of the yin yang of the rising and the falling, the rocky solidity and sharpness against the soft, vaporous moisture. We have lots of what were called hemp fiber texture brush strokes. So the kind of abstract quality of the brush stroke, whether it's the hemp fiber or the Mi-style ink dots and folded ribbon strokes, all of these are looking back to the Chinese tradition and making it work for this assertion of Korea as a grand and magnificent place.